Before we begin this episode of Indefinable Magic, we would like to say that, well, actually, all I'd like to say is you may feel like you've heard some of this before, but you haven't. It's simply that on a couple of occasions I cover similar ground or use similar examples to those used in my bite-size Indefinable Magic about 73 yards. And that's because there's a little bit of crossover, but I hope those examples are used and phrased in a different way that justifies what might initially sound like repetition, but isn't, I promise. Welcome to Indefinable Magic. Vaguely themed word collisions with a rich seam of Doctor Who flavoured irrelevance running through them. Written and performed by me, Toby Haydock. Tonight's episode, Behind the Sofa. The forces of evil are abroad tonight. We like being scared, don't we? Things that go bump in the night. I mean, at my age, what goes bump in the night is usually my head, or, more painfully, my shins, as one or other collides with a bedside or a beam as I grope in the darkness for the increasingly necessary late-night wee. I'm not scared of those bumps, though, just resigned to them. The more traditional terrors are lurking in night's inky blackness, though. They still have the capacity to send a shiver up my spine. Or is it down? Up or down, don't care which. The darkness and what might lurk within still stirs the residue of childish fearfulness that lurks within my increasingly decrepit and leaky frame. I don't like being scared. And when I am so now, it's usually just a fleeting moment when I'm suddenly transported back to childhood. It's not me being actually scared so much as being transported back to a time when I did get scared, I think. Look, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. I'm not a 50-year-old man who is afraid of the dark, okay? But we seek out the horrific in our entertainment, don't we? We actively look for it. We deliberately provoke the glands and senses and body parts that react, sometimes alarmingly, to terrifying situations. I've got any number of films on my shelf which are designed specifically to give me, and you, should you like to come round for tea, the creeps. It gives our brains a bit of a workout, I suppose, exercising that fight-or-flight muscle should we ever need to properly activate it whilst, I don't know, hitchhiking through the woods at midnight or having to outrun the undead. A lot of fear is also about expectation. We know, as we watch the opening moments of a horror film or a Doctor Who story, that the man who is advancing on that curious green thing or apparently dead body or curious blobby smoky thing making a horrible noise, well, we know they're going to come to a sticky end. Run, we yell, stuck behind the glass of the TV screen, unable to penetrate his ears with our warnings. Don't touch it! Which of course he does, idiot. But isn't that strangely consoling? We watch a terrible thing that we know is going to happen to a shoddy bit part player, a stupid guard, or a cocky teenager, and then we tell ourselves that we'd never have done that. We'd have run at the first sign of the malevolence spewing forth from the air conditioning, or the talking slime in our boudoir, or the version of our uncle with fangs, or whatever. And people talk affectionately about being scared as a kid, don't they? It's like drama, especially scary drama, being a kind of preparation for real life. I'm not sure I remember any other kind of childhood lessons with such affection. There's no warm, nostalgic wave as I recall my mother telling me the importance of not eating random mushrooms, or yelling at me for not looking as I crossed the road, or lecturing me on not spraying lighter fluid on the fire. Yeah, all right, I got help for that, okay? The beauty of entertainment is that it psychologically prepares us for real life, whilst also being brilliant fun. Take note, parents. A lesson that no matter how fast our heart beats or how bristling the hairs on the back of our necks are, actually, when the credits roll or we close the book, we're actually fine. Oh, until that floorboard creaks or that window rattles or, thanks to Doctor Who, that plastic daffodil drops out of a packet of washing powder. And yet we are drawn back. Again and again we force ourselves to watch through our fingers or from behind the sofa. Just as some of the best comedy, say, is transgressive, it takes us as far as we're prepared to go, taste-wise, and then produces an involuntary spasm, in this case laughter, when the punchline breaks the tension by undercutting it or surprising us, so too does horror tease us. It leads us slowly by the hand towards the place that we are unsure about. And then it makes us leap up or cry out when the hand smashes through the door or the corpse falls out of a cupboard or the monster looms out of the darkness. Comedy and horror, those extremes, are very close bedfellows, actually. A bit like sex and death. I mean, not in that case, literally, unless it is for you, and then I'm afraid kink-shaming you I will be. But just as left and right, politically, eventually kind of meet each other as they get more extreme, so too comedy and horror push the same buttons and use the same methods to produce a response. Which is why Doctor Who, which at its best balances humour and terror absolutely perfectly, is the greatest programme in the history of the world ever, provoking, as it does, those two most primal responses, fear and laughter. And a spoonful of humour always helps the horror to go down, which is why some of the very best writers of scary Doctor Who, Holmes, Banks Stewart, Moffat, also do some of the best jokes. And as many of my ex-wives will tell you, being in close proximity to the comedic means you're also never too far away from the absolutely horrific. Human beings are drawn to that which terrifies them, as many of my ex-wives will... Yeah, all right, you get the picture. And even people who hate Doctor Who delight in recalling their terror at, well, it depends on their age. The one with the maggots, for example. The one with the spiders. Oh, yeah, 70s kids seemed particularly prone to oversized versions of real-life creatures. And I have to confess to never being entirely comfortable with the normal-sized version of such creatures in the first place myself. Now, I'm not sure that's down to Doctor Who. It's more, actually, that clever Doctor Who was capitalising, in The Green Death and Planet of the Spiders, on that already innate fear we have of bugs or creepy crawlies. Watching Planet of the Spiders, to be fair, I'm more scared of the flares or Gareth Hunt's sideburns or Jenny Laird's acting than I am of the oversized arachnids, but that's because I wasn't a kid when I first watched it. In real life, however, I will give your actual 8 legs a wide berth, and my other half is worse. She forces me to catch them in a glass and release them outside, lest they hang around and feast on her during the night, despite this never having happened in the history of the world, ever. And I have to confess that no matter how scared I might be of a creepy crawly, I never kill them. Interestingly, I'm terrified of wasps, but that is mostly, I think, because I've never been stung by one. And here's another thing. My fear of what it might be like scares me more than, I suspect, the reality. Had I actually ever been stung by a wasp, I'd have a frame of reference, so could psychologically prepare myself for what would happen. This way, though, not having had that experience, the unknown is what scares me. And Doctor Who teaches us how irrational fear of the unknown actually is, and then, repeatedly, capitalises upon that to great effect. It's what you don't see that is often the most terrifying, and this is played out to great advantage in a television programme that often only has the resources to show you a glimpse of something anyway. So, as it's the season of the witch right now, I thought I'd muse upon Doctor Who's unique role in entertainment. It's something that scares and comforts us at the same time. It's like a big warm bowl of soup with a flesh-eating creature buried within it. It takes us back to childhood, where it originally served as, depending on who you are, a sole moment of happiness during a difficult period, or a reminder of a more innocent time now that we're adults in the horrible and different kind of scary real world. But as the great Robert Holmes once said, often at its best, Doctor Who's sole motivation is to frighten the little buggers to death. Not out of sadism. It actually serves a helpful purpose. Containable fear. It's the televisual equivalent of the cane. My dad gave me 6 of the best episodes of gothic horror at weekly intervals. Never did me any harm. Today's snowflakes wouldn't be melting if they'd been forged in the Antarctic of the seeds of doom. You know, that kind of thing. But it is a serious point. It's why fairy tales were conceived. Give children something fictional to be scared of, and it helps them to explore, to understand, and to negotiate their emotional makeup, which will come in useful when they become grown-ups with a universe of their own terrors to face. In Doctor Who's most recent season, I was interested to note that 73 Yards seems to have been perhaps the story that most people of my age responded to the most positively. Perhaps because it reminded them of those old-fashioned scares of the BBC ghost stories for Christmas, or of Susan Hill's The Woman in Black, or more specifically Nigel Neal's adaptation of it, which starred Captain Rigg and Lady Painfort and Professor Crimpton from the War Machines. What I loved most about 73 Yards was the fact that the scariest thing about it was the simplest. A woman gesturing slightly indistinctly, just in the distance. Nothing abnormal, just normality in an off-putting context. Dissonant, slightly weird. Wrong. And that's the oddest thing about horror. The simpler it is, the more effective. Big, giant monsters are all well and good, but a kid with a gas mask crying for his mummy, an impassive statue moving but only when you don't look at it, feet glimpsed stopping at the bed under which you are hiding. Oh yeah, they're the stuff of nightmares. I'm not sure I ever did hide behind the sofa, you know. I don't even think Doctor Who actually gave me any real nightmares. I have found science fiction scary, I think. Yeah, maybe. A late-night viewing of The Omega Man, the Charlton Heston starring version of Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. But to be fair, the creatures in that, even though they're basically men with contact lenses, come out only at night and are, I think, even referred to as vampires. So it's kinda end-of-the-world sci-fi, but it uses the tools of horror. Now, I haven't dared watch it since I did as a 9-year-old. Yes, I know. I've got help for that too. Partly because I recall how scared I was then, and partly because I don't want to rewatch to show me that fangs ain't what they used to be. I treasure that feeling of fear, you see, so much that I don't actually want to sully it with my subsequent 41 years of experience and savviness. As we know from our love of Doctor Who, keeping that child within us alive, even a really scared one, is an important tool in our armoury for negotiating the world and all that it throws at us. So I'm fondly nostalgic, weirdly, about the fear I felt watching The Omega Man, and I don't want to ruin that by the cold light of a 50-year-old's day. But it is horror that specifically scares me, I think, as opposed to sci-fi. I mean, yeah, Alien is scary in a sort of tense way, and yes, the creature leaps out and grabs you in the dark. But a lot of those jump scares are horror genre stuff anyway. But even so, Alien's not the same flavour of fear that sort of out-and-out scary, supernaturally flavoured horror has. Or what I associate as horror. See, I don't worry about aliens impregnating me and spoiling my noodles. I'm unlikely to find an alien egg lurking in my shed. I do, however, sometimes tremble at the thought of some sort of ancient terror inhabiting the shadows of a dark, empty house, or leaping out at me during a nocturnal perambulation in the local woodland. I'm not scared of the dark. Oh, no, but I'm bloody terrified of what might be in it. But for some reason, I think a vampire or a ghost to be a more terrifying and likely prospect to be lurking in the shadows than a Martian or a Carrionite. And so I think the scariest Doctor Who got for me when I was a kid was State of Decay, once I twigged that the man with the navy eye makeup and Richard III haircut was a vampire. Yeah, not an alien, not a villain or a mad scientist, but a vampire. They were those things from horror movies. And Orkon and his cohorts, Camilla and Zargo, oh, that was clever, wasn't it? Their names were cunningly disguised through metamorphosis. These days they'd just be called Vernon, Valerie and Victor Empire or some such, but those were different times. So yeah, whilst I'd not been scared of Doctor Who as such, I was terrified by the little glimpses I had had of more forbidden fruit, late-night snatches of Hammer horror or half-glimpsed moments from Universal horror pictures. They were often on late-night double bills, and they were genuinely frightening. Now, that doesn't mean I was blasé about Doctor Who. Oh, no. I was gripped and I was excited. I was thrilled. I'd leap about afterwards. But I don't think it ever made me fear for my safety. Not like those midnight feasts of fear made in spooky black and white and haunted by a cast list of long-dead actors. I'll be honest, though, there were more immediate terrors to be had growing up in the 1980s. The toxicity of the extremes of left and right-wing politics that divided the nation was at an absolute peak. Enter 2024 at this point to say, hold my beer. But in the shadow of divisive politics lurked a danger that seems like it might strike at any moment. Ancient creatures of the night were positively acoustic when compared to the high-tech, plugged-in surround sound peril at the touch of a big red button that would unleash nuclear Armageddon upon us all. Never mind the fungoids, mushroom clouds were the real danger, and as a teenager, fact and fiction were hugely preoccupied by our oncoming obliteration. And so, sorry Doctor Who, but the scaredest I have ever been of television was in a BBC dramatised documentary called The War Game. All old newsreel stock and BBC-style narration with non-professional actors depicting with bland naturalism that somehow made it so much more real what would happen should the bomb go off. This was part of, and I kid you not, a sort of nuclear apocalypse season on the BBC, and the hitherto banned film was something I watched out of curiosity, tempted because it had been withheld from us up until now. And afterwards, I was so scared I asked my sister if I could sleep in her room and begged her to reassure me that it wouldn't happen. The best she could come up with was that it probably would, but maybe not for a couple of years. Thanks, sis. We didn't mess about in the 1980s. Well, if I was a snowflake then, I may as well be told I'd melt pretty bloody quickly once those missiles were unleashed. And yet, despite all those nuclear-powered headlines, and programmes, and even a song which euphemistically unleashed 99 red balloons, you couldn't escape the spectre of atomic annihilation, even on top of the pops. I was never scared by nuclear weapons when they appeared in Doctor Who. I wouldn't say the threat of war is the least scary thing about Warriors of the Deep because, well, the murker. But I never found myself hiding behind the sofa when Maddox synced up, or indeed when the missiles in The Mind of Evil or Battlefield appeared. I didn't even get scared of the Z-bomb, well, apart from the pronunciation. I have to say, I'm always pretty terrified that our language will be corrupted, but fortunately, in real life, the 1986 predicted in the 10th Planet has now been and gone, and I'm happy to report that in this country at least, Zed's not dead, baby. Zed's not dead. Although, actually, it's just occurred to me that one of the many books in the subgenre of what happens after the nuclear apocalypse that I got obsessed by in the 1980s, you see, I was scared, but I kept going back to it, was Robert C. O'Brien's Z for Zachariah. But O'Brien was American, so he'd have called it Z for Zachariah, and I've been doing it all wrong in my head all of this time. It's strange that you don't think about that until you come to it from a different angle. I've probably just horrified a lot of American listeners. Apologies if so. But anyway, back to the point, before I segue us into Armageddon, which would be a worse way to die than in nuclear fallout. I slept in my sister's room the night that I watched the war game because I was sick to my stomach with genuine, agonizing, gnawing fear. And to be honest, I wasn't a brave little boy. Our house in the middle of nowhere was a gold mine for the nightmare-stricken. Trees outside the single glazed windows would cast ominous shadows. And the nights were windy, cold and windy. Oh, good Lord, they were always cold. So cold, I think, Varga and his mates would have happily settled there and left leader Clinton Penley to argue about science until they were both blue in the face, which young Toby frequently was, but blue because of the temperature. And as the wind blew, those shadowy, silhouetted branches would scratch at the windows like some taloned creature of the night, a phantasmagoric Cathy trying to get in at my window. I would wrap my duvet around my neck tightly, because then I would, at least, I figured, get prior warning, should some passing Nosferatu try to move that duvet aside in order to access my jugular. That was my logic. The necessary action from the passing sanguivore would disturb my sleep and give me a fighting chance of making a hasty exit, or at least to somewhere within reach of the nearest crucifix. I mean, I knew these things didn't exist. Didn't I? I mean, I was genuinely a bit scared. The passage of time makes it hard for me to know how real this was, but I have to be honest and say that even now I still do get a bit jumpy in the dark, even though I'm pretty chilled out about the whole vampire thing. I'm pretty sure we're a werewolf-free zone too, and I haven't seen a zombie around these here parts in forever. But I don't know if I'm not so scared of vampires now because I've got older, or because the poor undead sods have to be sad these days too, and half of them are more likely to bore me to death than feast on my claret, but let's not get into that. What I'm trying to get at is why the ancient, the fusty, those things associated with folklore and the resurrection of the dead are always more scary to me than green-skinned aliens, even really convincing ones. We had a book as kids called The Horrific World of Monsters. I loved it because it had some pretty good sections on Doctor Who. This was a time when you didn't have videos or DVDs to hand and you had to scour bookshelves just to get a fix. Under D in this book were the Daleks, with a picture of John Pertwee and a pair of pepper pots from Planet of the Daleks, and another one captioned The Black and White Daleks from Doctor Who, with a picture from Evil of the Daleks, including the exploded Emperor, and I had no idea what that was. Oh, this was a gateway to Narnia. There was also Cybermen. They can, fortunately, said the text, be destroyed by laser guns. And there was a picture of a squad of them from the invasion. And justifying a whole 3 pictures were the Ice Warriors, including one that purported to be from the War Games, which confused me. I didn't know about the monster roll call in Part 10 at this point. In the pre-video age, as I've said, this was gold dust. Not the type deadly to Cybermen. After all, Cybermen are killed by laser guns. It said so in the book, remember? But for the eager whoer, these pictures were fantastic. But of course, and as it has done so many times before and since, Doctor Who here served as a gateway to other things. And in this case, in the book, The Horrific World of Monsters, it was a gateway to more plausible horrors. As I leafed through this catalogue of ghastlies to get my Who fix, I went past all sorts of other things of an altogether more grisly hue, the atmosphere accentuated by the spooky black and white pictures from ancient films. And so, in that cold house, never short of a sudden gust to go right across the back of the neck at a terrifying moment, I'd read about zombies and the golem and real-life horrors like Satan from old etchings and paintings and ancient documents. Terrifying. This mixture of fiction and fact, that depiction of a goat-like Satan, wasn't from a film. This was the actual, real Satan in a painting, made for a heady cocktail. Again, the aliens didn't really frighten me. I could handle a close encounter of the third kind, but the devil riding out, that seemed all too real. That's why The Demons, I think, is so clever, and perhaps so fondly remembered, because it takes the iconography of black magic and makes it extraterrestrial, which is perhaps why that was long lauded as the ultimate Jon Pertwee tale, and maybe why it's one of my favourites of the era. Even though I find it a bit too cosy to be totally scary, I do appreciate what it's up to. The futuristic, it seemed to me, was all clean and gleaming and sparkly, but the ancient, that was all cobwebs and shadows and darkness, and from the olden days. And everyone from the olden days is, and this is undeniable, dead now. Much more terrifying. This book, this brilliant book, which I'd go back to time and time again, introduced me to classics of horror like The Phantom of the Opera and The Creature from the Black Lagoon, and even something called Quatermass that, it's fair to say, I got a bit intimate with later on. Those old movies were the real totems of horror, not this series I loved and was nonetheless gripped by. So I've always been secretly rather pleased when anyone I know has been frightened by Doctor Who. It's a demonstration that it still has power. And I was told recently that audience feedback, even with the most modern Who, tends to indicate that viewers like Doctor Who best when it tries to scare them. Parents know that it's because the kids don't really have anything to be scared by because, well, it's just Doctor Who doing what Doctor Who does. And kids know that, well, yeah, they're scared, but their parents let them watch it, so deep down they know that it must be okay, really. Mustn't it? And I love hearing stories from fellow fans who either decided not to watch Doctor Who themselves when they were younger because they'd been too terrified of the Cybermen in the sewers or the blank-faced policeman, or whose parents had taken that decision out of their hands and forbade them from watching it out of fear that the images that had been seared into their minds for a whole week would make nervous wrecks of them for life. And as an aside at this point, I think Mary Whitehouse's objection to Doctor Who's violence wasn't that kids really would be scared of it. I think the fear there really was that they'd be thrilled by it and therefore seek to imitate it. And that is a whole different podcast. Anyway, back to the horrors. I remember when Doctor Who came back watching the Doctor Dances with my then partner, no shrinking Violet herself. We'd once watched The Ring together on date night. Oh yeah, I know how to woo the ladies. Dinner and The Shining, anyone? And I remember when she gripped my hand during the Doctor Dances, genuinely spooked by that brilliant expressionistic camera move down the corridor that alighted upon the unstoppable gas-masked child. I suppose it wasn't her fear that really thrilled me, but rather the fact that she was so into it, she was enjoying it so much, that it had provoked a genuine response. None of this, oh, that wouldn't happen, or that's unrealistic, or, oh, he'd never do that. She was involved, so involved that she involuntarily grasped my hand. And this from someone who once ruined the atmosphere during a particularly tense sequence in an episode of Angel to question whether the person in mortal danger would really get a mobile signal in a built-up multi-storey car park area. "It's about a vampire with a soul in the 20th century, I yelled in despair, wondering if I'd ever find someone who'd kiss me and shut the f*** up during my favourite programmes. Reader, I never did. Which is why I now watch The X-Files at midnight whilst the house is asleep. In fact, the new Disney streaming witching hour broadcast of Doctor Who could have been specifically designed in order that I get to see it alone when nobody who lives with me can ruin it because they're unable to speak genre. Of course, it's not just the viewers. The makers of the show have occasionally worried when the programme has, in their eyes, gone too far. Philip Hinchcliffe, the maker of some of Doctor Who's scariest stories, famously axed 2 sequences before broadcast, deeming them heady stuff even for his constitution. Noah begging Vira to kill him as he transforms into viridescent bubble wrap in The Ark in Space caused concern because of the implication that death would be more appealing to the painful metamorphosis the commander was enduring. So it was as much the psychological horror there as the physical, but a successful synthesis of both combined with an affecting performance, and so made it the stuff of nightmares. The second too hot for Hinchcliffe moment pressed similar buttons, the transformation of Keeler from stricken man into scary monster. Mark Jones is so good as Keeler, it's easy to believe that his pain and fear would have been all too convincing, and would have been the real reason that that sequence was deemed a scare too far, as opposed to the presumably fairly simple crossfade from the half-made-up Jones to the fully costumed monster, which would have carried off the effects side of things, standard Doctor Who fare, and therefore likely to be not especially visceral. It would have been performance that tipped it over. Now, on both of these occasions, that performance is clearly key when it comes to the effectiveness of the horror. If the people on screen aren't scared, then, well, we aren't going to be either. But if the acting is really good, then we don't even need to see what it is they are frightened of, because we feel it ourselves. Indeed, how often have we been scared in real life because of the person we're with? Now, if someone isn't scared and is either brave or humorous in the potentially terrifying situation, then that helps us in real life. On a film, on the other hand, or TV, well, then it's a surefire sign that the brazen brave fellow or the piss-taking idiot is going to be the first one to get eaten, which is why those moments work so well. The other thing that unites these moments is that they both concern someone who was human, becoming a monster. Noah into Widden, Keeler into Crinoid. Monsters are scary, sure, but something which is a parody of the human form, something which was us that becomes something else, that is somehow more transgressive and disturbing. It's related in a way to the strangeness of the distant woman in 73 Yards. Both remind us of something normal, but in skewing the everyday, the recognisable just slightly, they become more disconcerting than something totally way out. It's a desecration of normality, and we find that really strange. See also the lone figure facing a wall at the end of the Blair Witch Project. No latex, no special effects, no noise even. Man, wall. Terrifying simplicity, and terrifying because of the incongruity. Now, I did have a moment when Doctor Who got me when I was old enough to know better. And it wasn't on a dark, rain-lashed night with the wind whispering uncertainties as it danced about and taunted me. Nope, it was a hot summer's day, and I'd just come back from HMV with the Ice Warrior box set VHS. I'd been on a bus. A bus! Not a ghost train or a haunted house or a windswept moor. The 192, and that's only scary when it's kicking out time. Of course, when I got the set home that sunny afternoon, I watched the documentary on missing episodes first. Of course I did. And if that surprised you, then you don't know me well enough. Where the hell have you been living? Hong Kong? Contained within the documentary's majesty was a lengthy clip from Fury from the Deep. Mr. Oak and Mr. Quill, two comically juxtaposed physicalities, standing framed in the doorway. The tallest of them, Mr. Quill, contorted his impassive skeletal physiognomy into a grotesque malformation as the camera crept in on him. Eyes bulging, he exhaled poison gas like a sour-breathed cadaver. Human, but not quite human. No effects, just a well-chosen actor, a haunting score, and some top-drawer gurning of the most unnerving kind. It was such a shockingly well-realised sequence that I found myself, for the first time in years, if ever, rather genuinely disturbed, even frightened by the experience. And so disturbed, so frightened, that I kind of liked it. Because the truth is, the thing about being scared to death is that it reminds you that, amidst the drudgery and insecurity and mundanity of real life, even with its horrors, that jump, those goosebumps, That beating heart flapping away. Well, all of those things remind you, as your body dances with grotesque exhilaration, as the adrenaline that has been activated courses through your body, that despite all the terrors out there that there are to face, that might be lurking around the corner, that might come knocking on your door, that right now, just at this moment, you've never been so conscious that you are alive. Thanks for listening to Indefinable Magic. This week's episode, Behind the Sofa, was written and presented by me, Toby Haydoke. The podcast artwork is by Dylan Patterson, and the music for Indefinable Magic has been specially composed by Dominic Glynn. I'm grateful to the many patrons who make these podcasts possible, and they include Steve Hatcher, Matthew Harris, Michael Harvey, Duncan Harvey, Ronald Hayden, Paul Hayes, Matthew Herbert, Stephen Hill, Simon Hodges, Andrew Hodson, Sam Hollingsworth, Matthew Hooliston, Darren Howard, Neil Humphreys, Tom Hunter-Watts, Steve Herr, Paul Ingerson, Ed Jefferson, Robert Jewell, Judith Jackson, William Keith, Peter Kelly, James Kersey, Matthew Kilburn, Colin Kilpatrick, Paul Kirkley, Andy Kitching, Chris Knight, Hendrik Korzeniowski, Pete Lack, Guy Lambert, Pete Lambert, Andy Larson, Erica Lear, Jonathan Lertargad, Paul Lindblad, Neil Little, Mark Leadsom, Andrew Lester, Andrew Llewellyn, Paul Loveday, Jacob Lumley, Nate Lynch, Simon Liss, Man in a Skirt Alert, Philip Marsh, Joe McLachlan, Glenn MacLeod, Steve Manfred, Nick Mellish, James Miller, Phil Mitchell, John Molyneux, and Justin E. Monaghan. If you too would like to become a patron, please go to patreon.com/Toby Haydoke, where for as little as £3 a month you get advance releases, bonus material, and all sorts of other goodies. You can also donate at kofi.com/Toby Haydoke, or you can give these a 5-star review and a few lines saying what you like about them anywhere that you find them available, on iTunes, on Apple, on Podbean, on Spotify, even now on YouTube. Liking, subscribing, thumbs-upping, 5-starring, it all really helps to lead other people to these podcasts. I'm on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and I'm easy to find because I've got a very stupid name. And I'm grateful to everybody who listens to these podcasts. I really am. It makes it worth sitting in a booth at the witching hour, talking nonsense on my own into a microphone, just like Adrienne Barbeau in The Fog. And that's another scary story for another time. I have released this at an appropriate juncture, so I hope you've listened to it then as well, in which case my wishes to you for the spookiest and scariest of Halloweens will not seem out of date.